Hello everyone. We are on chapter 4, which is written by Olga Lehmann and Sven Hroar Klempe. The title of the chapter is The Centrality of Aesthetics for Psychology. One way to describe this chapter would be to say that the authors are requiring from us to enrich our concept of the Gestalt, because that is relevant for our understanding of aesthetics and aesthetic experience, which is in turn itself required for our understanding of the scope of psychology. So we want to first understand what a Gestalt is or can be, that the relevance of that concept for aesthetic experience, and the relevance of aesthetic experience in turn for psychology and the scope of psychology, and our demands and expectations from what kind of science psychology should be. So let's begin with the concept Gestalt. Textbook examples that we see when we think about the concept of Gestalt tend to be themselves simplistic, which is ironic because the concept Gestalt themselves is an anti-simplistic concept, but when we think of typical examples of showing the concept Gestalt, those examples are relatively simplistic. We see, for example, look, if you put these bent lines next to each other, a shape emerges out of them. But Gestalts can be so much more. A Gestalt can consist of parts or material and form, or in totality, the whole, but also a history, a set of emotions associated with the parts and the form, and a movement towards a future or future transformation that are anticipated in that instant. We can add to this relationship with the subject. The emergence of a Gestalt might depend on the individual's particular history. So you and I might look both at the same building, and you might perceive a Gestalt because that building was a place where you grew up. So the building, the Gestalt associated with the building, the perception of it is revealed to you because of your particular individual history, but not to me because I don't share that history. So all those elements, all those dimensions they could be included, should be included in our understanding of what it means when we talk about what it is meant when we talk about Gestalt. A Gestalt can also be, this is an important point for this chapter, a Gestalt can be a combination of contradictory parts that when you combine them, you create a tension. In this painting by McGree, for example, do we see intimacy or do we see impossibility of intimacy? Or in this painting, is this a pipe? Do we trust the text or the image? Now, we might think that these are rare occasions, rare examples. They're not typical of part-whole combinations. We might think that there is usually a harmony between the parts and the whole. But the disharmony that was exemplified in those two paintings by McGree, the disharmony, if not essential to art and aesthetic experience, is quite common to it. Art expresses or strives to express, on the one hand, individuality, particularity. So you watch a movie not about men and women in general, an abstract concept of men and women. You watch a movie about, or you hear a story about Harry and Sally, this particular man, this particular woman. At the same time that art strives to reveal individuality, particularity, it also reveals something that goes beyond those particular situations, hinting at generality, something universal is revealed. So that's the combination of two opposite poles, particularity and universality. Or think about the juxtaposition of human desire on one hand, human desire for immortality, absolute truth, absolute freedom, absolute control over nature on the one hand, and on the other hand, the impossibility of accomplishing them, accomplishing all those ideals or all those aims. I've heard people say that it is characteristic of art that it fails. This is separate from, in addition to art occasionally addressing failure, talking about failure. We are now talking about art itself failing, and that being characteristic of art, that it succeeds when it embodies a type of failure. And that could be explained due to the irresolvable tension between parts, the material of art, and the forms it wants to take, and the world that it signals through those forms. Talking about contradictions in art or in aesthetic experience implies that these experiences can carry a dilemma, that they invite us to make decisions, to choose among possible scenarios. to resolve ambiguity. That's why the authors of this chapter urged us, the readers, to not just insist that we should pay attention to emotions or feelings as part of human psychology. That's not enough. But that these emotions, we should also insist that these emotions are part of gestalts, scenarios that contain dilemmas, which ask for resolution, invite choice from us, and so on. Let's set aside the theme of contradiction and dilemma for now. Another topic discussed in this chapter is the use of vertical metaphors. What do these vertical metaphors do? They include a metaphor of a house, a metaphor of a tree, and a musical metaphor of polyphony, which is a simultaneous grasping experience of different voices, which produce a musical gestalt. So the use of vertical metaphors allow us to describe grasping simultaneously different layers of an aesthetic experience. And actually it is by grasping simultaneously different layers of an instant, of a moment, it is by doing that an aesthetic experience is emerged. An example that is described in the chapter is dancing, and I'm going to stay with this example for a while until I think the end of my presentation. So, an example of dancing. There are formal ways of dancing in which dancing is formalized according to some schematic. Rhythms, steps, patterns of movement are identified and we attempt to imitate them, or we instruct students to imitate them. These patterns are abstract ways of organizing the content of dancing. There is so much stuff going on underneath the schema. That's what I'm referring to when I say content. Some of this content might be tacit and outside of our conscious awareness. For beginners who want to learn such a formalized dance, they're going to be given the schema. So a beginning dancer who wants to dance formally according to schema, that person is given the schema but not the underlying content, because the underlying content has to come from bottom up, has to come from the lived experience and movements of the dancer. So in the beginning, dancing formally according to formalized routines is awkward. It has to do at first with fulfilling some standards, pre-given standards and instructions of a dance teacher. In contrast to formalized dance, we have informal dancing or pre-formal dancing. And that is not based on schema, but it is based on lived experience. It is life-based. It is so non-formal, pre-formal dancing, which is life-based. It is content that is exploring its own possible forms. It is form that is in the process of becoming, or you can say it is poiesis. Dancing without a priori form is explorative. It is based on sensing and feeling a music and re-expressing music. So you hear a piece of music and you want to re-express that music again in the medium of bodily movement. This is similar, by the way, to how I am taking these chapters and re-expressing them, finding a new form for them in the new medium of video presentation. So it would be a total failure if I just replicate the content of the chapter, just read it out loud. Dancing is like that. It is re-expressing something that one finds in one media and trying to put it in a different medium of bodily movement. But once you have music plus dancing, there's a new gestalt. And not just that, but there's a foundation for further building of gestalts. Now, continuing that, imagine a married couple who have lived together for 30 years, dancing to a song, one particular song that they have known and danced to occasionally over decades. So imagine them listening to that song and dancing together. In that moment, there is history. History that is not just in the past, but is also felt. The history is acknowledged in that moment that they're dancing together. There's also musical material that is repeated over decades, but is still alive because now it is again being played. There's their movements, how they feel about each other, how familiar they are to each other, their shared perspectives, or even their differences and disagreements. That is grasping all of those elements in one moment. That is a poetic instant, which is introduced in this chapter by the authors, which is, to quote, the very moment in which Everything seems to interlock and build up a totality of meaning. And as the authors point out, this isn't something they receive, the two dancers in our example. It is not just something that they're passively receiving, but something that they are creating together, moment by moment. How is this relevant to psychology? It is relevant because by recognizing the concept of Gestalt, its relevance to aesthetic experience and aesthetics, it puts different set of standards for what kind of psychology, what kind of science psychology should be, what kind of expectations we should have from psychology. Psychology should at least have some space for grasping, acknowledging, appreciating the kind of experience that we find in these grasping of aesthetic instance or poetic instance. Thank you for your attention.